Welcome to the Runners Connect, Run to the Top, Extra Kick podcast.
Hey Runners Connect fans, Coach Hayley, your community manager here. Welcome to the Runners Connect, Run to the Top, Extra Kick podcast. Hope you guys are having a great day and thanks so much for tuning in. I'm here to answer your running and training questions so that you can train smarter, stay healthy and achieve your goals. We have a great question from Scott today, but before we get to Scott's question, I just want to thank today's sponsor. Sometimes it can be so nice to take in your surroundings and be left to your own thoughts on a long, quiet run. Other times, I just need something to take my mind off of it. I'm not really a fan of running to music. It just doesn't suit me and I quickly get sick of the same playlist. I do enjoy listening to a good podcast like this one. However, I've recently discovered that I love listening to a good book. That's why I decided to give Audible a try, and I'm so glad that I did. It's got a ton of great running and non-running related books. What I love is the flexibility to adapt your choice to your mood. You can listen to something lighthearted to keep your spirits up if you're having a rough run, or you can multitask and learn something new in nutrition, training, or psychology. I'm currently listening to Once a Runner. It's one of my favourite books, a classic inspirational running story. I've read it before, but I've recently been desperate to reread it and haven't found the time. Now I can use my long runs to get through it. It definitely makes the time go quicker. Audible has a free 30-day trial so that you can test it out and see what you think. Check out Audible's extensive running selection and start your free 30-day trial at runnersconnect.net/audible. Alright, now here's today's question. Should you do a long run once a week or should you do one once every 2 weeks? How should you schedule your long runs around your other training runs? Should it be sandwiched between 2 easy runs? Or can you do a workout the day before or after a long run? That's a great question, Scott. I'll answer the first part first. If your definition of a long run is a run longer than your usual running distance or longer than the other runs you complete during the week, which is what my definition is, then my answer is yes, you should complete one every week. Long runs are the cornerstone of any training program. They improve aerobic base, running economy, and can give you a great confidence boost in terms of covering a distance. However, how I suggest incorporating them is different depending on your ability level and race distance. For less experienced runners, the long run will likely be all easy pace with the main aim of progressing the distance. In that situation, I'd suggest alternating weeks in which you increase the distance of the long run. For example, you'd have 1 week where you progress to a new long run distance, followed by a week in which you return to a long run distance that you're comfortable with and have done before. By progressing the long run this way, you'll prevent overtraining and recover between the long runs, which you're doing every other week. So say a beginner runner is starting out with the longest run of 5 miles. They might have a long run where they try and do 6 1 week. The next week, they might drop it back down to 4 or 5 before progressing to 7 the week after. This technique is also useful for marathoners, even more experienced ones, who are doing very long runs of 20 miles or more. These marathon runners may alternate very long runs of 20 to 22 miles with a shorter long run of 16 to 18 miles on alternate weeks. I know a lot of more experienced marathoners who do this, and it allows them to recover in between the long runs, but they still get in a long run every week. I tend to do that myself as I find that running a very long run each week leaves me fatigued. So the second part of your question, how to schedule these long runs around your other training. Again, this may depend on your ability level and the distance that you're aiming for. Early on in a training program, or for less experienced runners, I'd suggest taking at least one easy day before and after the long run. This is especially important if you're progressing to new distances. These days should comprise of an easy and short run or even a rest day. As runners get more experienced and more comfortable with the easy pace runs, especially if they're aiming for a marathon, we at Runners Connect like to include a slightly harder run, a steady state run, the day before the long run. This isn't done necessarily every week, but it's a great training tool to include. It does mean that you'll be performing the long run with a little bit of fatigue in the legs, but that's just what you'll be experiencing in the latter half of your race on race day. This steady and long run combination is best done with an easy run the day before and after it. So you might do an easy run, the next day a steady run, the day after your long run, and then an easy day after that. However, you do have that hard day before the long run day. This training technique is best used by runners who are confident of running the distance in their long run and have some experience with long runs. So, can you do a hard workout the day before a long run? In the example above, the steady long run combination, yes, you can. How about tempo and interval runs? Again, you can, and it's something I've done in my training. However, as a beginner runner, I wouldn't do it. I'd make sure to have that easy day before and after. If you're a little more experienced and it's unavoidable, for example, you can only fit a workout and a long run in on consecutive days in your week, then if the long run is all easy pace, I'd say that's okay for more experienced runners. However, you'll definitely want to take a rest day after that long run. I'd also avoid doing this if your long run is a quality long run, so it includes a fast finish or is a progression type long run. I'd avoid doing this too if you're building up the distance of your long run. But once you're comfortable doing a long run every week and you're not adding to it, you're just maintaining the distance of it and it is all easy pace, then if you have to, including a tempo run or an interval run the day before that long run isn't necessarily an awful thing. However, do remember that running so far on very tired legs carries an injury risk. Your form might not be as good as it otherwise would be, and this can make you injury prone. I love that question. Thanks so much for asking. For those of you listening that want to have your questions answered by one of the Runners Connect coaches, head over to runnersconnect.net/daily and click the record button to send your question over. Running with music just isn't for me. However, I do love listening to a good podcast like this one. Lately, I've discovered that I really enjoy listening to a good book. That's why I decided to give Audible a try. It's got a ton of great running and non-running related books. What I love is the flexibility to adapt my choice to my mood. You can listen to something light-hearted and fun to keep your spirits up, or use your run to learn something new. I'm currently listening to Once a Runner. It's one of my favourite books, a classic inspirational running story. Listening to it definitely makes the time go quicker, and I find I look forward to going out on my long run even more. Audible has a free 30-day trial so that you can test it out and see what you think. Check out Audible's extensive running selection and start your free 30-day trial at runnersconnect.net/audible. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you haven't already, consider heading over to iTunes or your favourite podcast directory and subscribing or leaving a review. It'd help us to reach more runners like you. Have a great day and be sure to tune in next time.